Well, a big thanks to everyone here joining us and Mr. Matt.
So my name is Matt Collins-Jones. I'm a senior Power Platform solution architect for Capgemini in the UK. I've got 10 plus years of experience with business applications. So I come from an end user background originally. I was a user of CRM 4.0 and then went through every iteration since then. I have been in support, I've been in delivery, pre-sales, basically everything, everything under the sun, and then ended up in solution architecture recently. I run a user group in the UK. I used to run an in-person user group. I now have started a virtual user group. Again, mainly because I don't know that many opportunities to travel these days. I am a cat dad. Those are my two cats, and I'm also a dad. As was mentioned, maybe before people joined, I'm also a Microsoft MVP. I'm a Microsoft MCT. Most people call me MCJ just because three letters are better than two. Those are all my links to all my social medias, so my YouTube, my blog, Twitter, GitHub, etc., etc. So, what we're going to talk about today. So, we're going to talk about what is an environment variable, how they can be used. We're going to talk about types of environment variables. I do have some live demos. I have not prayed to the demo gods, so anything could happen when we go through the live demos. I'm going to talk about some limitations, some advantages, and my conclusion on environment variables. So let's get stuck in. So what is an environment variable? An environment variable is a parameter that can be passed to Power Automate or Power Apps. So it is a piece of data essentially that you're taking from a specific location and you're passing it to an app, a Power App, or you're passing it to a Power Automate Cloud Flow or Desktop Flow. They can be environment specific, hence the name environment variable. This means that you can use them for ALM. So when you want to move solutions from one environment to the other environment, you don't have to manually go in and edit those flows and edit those apps and then create these dependencies that you're having to maintain all the time. So that's where the true power comes from. And I said it enables ALM for static data sources or configuration values. So things like SharePoint, for instance, things like API keys, you can use environment variables to actually get that static data or data sources and those configuration values. So there's loads of really great applications for them, and I'll go through a few of them today. Um, so what are we trying to achieve? And what we're trying to achieve is a unicorn with a cat riding on it, flying over a rainbow. And what I mean by that is we're looking for ALM perfection. We're looking for a way to use the inbuilt structures in the Power Platform to drive your ALM to make sure that you have a really healthy ALM process and you're not manually doing all these things. So we're basically looking for a unicorn, and it's not perfect, but environment variables help towards that overall goal of finding a unicorn. So in terms of ALM. Types of environment variables. These are the types of environment variables. So the six current environment variables. There are decimal numbers, there is JSON, there is text, yes, no, data source, and secret. So decimal number and text, those two are kind of self-explanatory. Yes, nos are Boolean values. JSON allows you to actually write some JSON code, so you could put a JSON object in there or an array inside inside some JSON and get some values from there. The JSON one is one that I actually find particularly useful because you can basically store configuration data for your deployment. So you could have key value pairs in your JSON, and the first step in your flow is to parse the JSON and get that data out. So you could put in, is this dev or is this live? Solution inversions, API, all sorts of different configuration data that you could put in there. Email addresses to send from a test environment, to send from a production environment, to send from a dev environment, all those sorts of things you could put in a single environment variable in a JSON block. Really useful, really versatile. Data sources. It allows you to configure. There's no asterisks on this slide, but there's an asterisk on another slide. Configure for a single data source, which is SharePoint at the moment. Now, as I was preparing for this demo, there are two new data sources in there, but neither of them in the documentation. So they will appear over time, just not appearing right now. So it does allow you to connect to various SharePoint sites and SharePoint lists using environment variables. The two new ones that I saw in there is a Dataverse data source, and there is a SAP data source as well. Again, these aren't in the documentation yet. You can't at least use the Dataverse one. I think that's to mitigate the issue with the legacy Dataverse connector being deprecated and being removed in the near future. And then there's Secret. So Secret is Azure Key Vault. So if you want to store keys and certificates and things like that and retrieve them, you can use the secret key that allows you to perform an action and pull that data back securely via Azure Key Vault into your Power Apps and your flows. And that's enough slides for now. So let's just get into the demos. So I'm going to go through a few things in the demos, and again, do pray for the demo gods for me because things can obviously go wrong. So I'm in my solution here, and I'll just walk you through creating a new environment variable. So you go up to new, you go to more, and then there's an option here for environment variable. You can put in a display name, so we could call it something like Portland UG. Gives it a schema name. You can give it a description, which is probably a really good thing to do, seeing as this is some sort of configuration ALM data. If the display name doesn't accurately reflect what you're doing, maybe you want to put a description in there, and then you can choose the data type. Now, depending on the data type that you choose, you'll get different options appearing to you. So for instance, if you choose data source, you can choose the connector. So we've got SharePoint. I said these two ones, Microsoft Dataverse and SAP ERP. These ones are undocumented at the moment. They've slipped into the platform, but you can't really use them at the moment. So we could choose SharePoint. Um, it asks for a connection to SharePoint, and then we can put in some parameters. So we could say if this is a list or a site, and then we can configure it from there. Conversely, if we use something like text, we just have what we call a default value and a current value. So this is the part. Oops, uh, everything's. Oh, I still good. I'm still good. Um, this is the part that confuses a lot of people. What is a default value and what is a current value? Both can be used in ALM, both can be used to configure environment variables, but a lot of people struggle with what default value and what current value is. So a default value is a value that you put in that could potentially never change. So when you move your solution from one environment to the other, if you need like a fallback, for instance, so if this is like an API endpoint, and you need to make sure that you never drop an API call, regardless of if it's in dev or if it's in test or if it's in production, and you always need to capture that, you could put something in here to make sure that if someone doesn't populate in a current value, that it can still use something. A current value will override whatever is in the default value. So default value is what it'll use by default. If you have a current value, it'll use that. So you can not put anything in the default and just put something in the current. You can not put anything in the current and just use the default, or you can use a combination of the two. But what it'll do is it'll just allow you to have that little bit of breathing space as you deploy solutions across. So it is a strange concept to now have that backup and that default, but that's kind of what it's used for. So default and current. Now I'm actually going to go through some environment variables that I've pre-configured and show you ones that do have defaults, ones that do have current values, and kind of how they go across in the ALM. So let's take a look at our first one, which is an API key. So I've configured this as just text, and one of the things that it allows you to do is it allows you to remove the current value if it's in a solution. That way, if you remove the current value, it doesn't get passed in the solution to the next environment. So as you push your solution across to your from your dev environment to your test environment, you can remove the current value, and then when you go to the next environment, it'll prompt you to add a current value as you go through, and we'll kind of show all these things as we go through the demo. So this one doesn't have a default value in here, and it doesn't have a current value in here. So there's no values in here. So we'll see what that does when we go through to the next environment. Next, I'm going to show you the SharePoint site. So the SharePoint site is exactly how we kind of made up that one before, but in this one, I'm going to I don't have a default value, but I do have a current value, and I've not removed this from my solution. But you can see here, there's a little pop-up says remove this value before exporting if it shouldn't be used in other environments, and there's a little option here to say remove some solution or delete from environments. So again, if I leave this in here, it's going to know what the current site is, and it's going to take that across to the next environment. So I've left that in here to, again, show you how that works as we go through. SharePoint list. So the way the SharePoint list works is that it's dependent on the SharePoint site. So you tell it the SharePoint site first, and the SharePoint site is this SharePoint site here, which is the environment variable here. And then we have the parameter type, which is list. And then again, I've not got a default value or a current value in here, but they do exist in this environment. And then last but by no means least, we've got solution number, and in the solution version number, I've actually got a default value. So not a current value, but a default value, so different from the list, sorry, different from the site. Again, just to show you how all these things work. So this is my my developer environment here, my Matt Collins Jones environment. Now, in the essence of speed, I've already exported my solution that I'll be importing into my next environment. This is my next environment. We can see it's called MCJ2 because I'm great at naming things. And we're going to hit import solution. We'll browse and we'll pick my solution, which is this nvar solution 100 managed. We'll hit next. And this will go through the regular process of importing things into the solution. So what I didn't touch on was that there are two other components in that solution. There is a flow and an app that we're going to go through. So regular import here, we'll choose next. Now it's realized that I need a connection to SharePoint. So because that's included in my environment variables, if I don't have one set up already, it will prompt me to create one, as we've got the new create button here. But because it knows, because I've done this before and I've already got one set up in this environment, it knows there is already a connection. So we can just choose next. And then comes the fun bit. So it's prompted me for 3 out of my 4 environment variables, and this is where people get this wrong a lot. And this is where people really struggle with environment variables. So it's pulled through my SharePoint one, my SharePoint site, but it's not allowing me to change it. It's telling me, right, okay, I've got this value, you can't change it now. This is the value that we're pushing in, and that's because our current value was set to this SharePoint site. It is, however, prompting me for my SharePoint list. So I've got 2 lists here. I've got MCJ list 1 and MCJ list 2. I know that my MCJ list 1 is for my dev environment and my MCJ list 2 is for my test environment. So I'm going to select MCJ list 2 here, and that's going to then configure that variable as I go through. I've also got the API key. So again, API key was where there was nothing in for current or default. It's just a text value. It's not dependent on the SharePoint site, etc. And I can just put an API key in here. So this is okay if the key is not like really sensitive. If a key is sensitive, you want to use something like a secret, or potentially you could configure the name for the API key, and then you can pull that data back with the Power Automate Azure Key Vault connector. So that's another really cool way to do this. We'll just shove some data in here for now, and that's our amazing API key that we came up with. So we'll click import. Now, I'm going to talk and bump for a few minutes while that's importing. Um, so what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you the Power App that I've made, which is just a really simple Power App to write data to a SharePoint list. And I'm going to show you a flow that has the API key and that solution version number in there as well. So my two SharePoint lists, this is my dev SharePoint list. So you can see it's called MCJ site 1, and we've just got a single line of data in here called test 1. And then conversely, my MCJ list 2 has a second one in that says test 2, but both belong to my MCJ site. If I wanted to configure a different site, I would need to remove that current value before I import. That's the important bit. Now, it's not the end of the world if I import it in and it's not right. Although it is a managed component, although it is part of a solution, you can edit it and make an unmanaged layer for the environment variables. And Microsoft do actually say that that is a fine thing to do. In the past, what I used to do is I used to suggest to people to create an environment variables solution and import that in first, and then import all my apps and flows in later, just to make sure that all the variables were configured ahead of those flows and apps going in. We'll go back and we're like, yay, it's imported and it's all working. So there's a little mvar solution here. So we'll go into our solution now. It's trying to give us some warnings that it's not it's a managed solution. You can't edit it. That's fine. What I want to do is I want to take a look at my flow and take a look at my Canvas app. So we will play our Canvas app first, and if we cross our fingers and hope that it worked, we can see. So um, this is a gallery. This gallery looks at data from my environment variable. The environment variable is pointing to list 2. So I can put in something like Portland UG rocks and hit the button and hope that I've done it right and it's gone in there. And if I go to my list 2 and maybe refresh, you can see Portland UG rocks. So it's gone to that new location, which is all great. That's all great. And if we go back to our apps for a second and go in here, little known fact, you can edit manage solutions if outside of the solution. Load up. So yeah, I just wanted to show you there's no smoke and mirrors. It wasn't always pointing to that location and things like that. It is an environment variable that we are using in our Canvas app, and I'll show you how to set up an environment variable in our Canvas app. Um, so this is our Canvas app. This is our gallery, and we can see it points to SharePoint list, which in our data source is just SharePoint list, which is our environment variable. Um, if you want to add an environment variable into a Canvas app, you can just go to add data, and then try to remember how it works. But hit SharePoint, choose SharePoint. There is an option for advanced on the right hand side. From there, you can choose your SharePoint site, which is our environment variable. And then again, there's a static number of lists that you can choose, or you could choose advanced here. And again, that's our SharePoint list environment variable. I've named these really great for a SharePoint demo, by the way. So yeah, so it's not smoke and mirrors. It is actually pointing to those environment variables. So that's all good. That's all great. What about flows, for instance? Let's go back a page. Too many tabs open. So we go back to our solution for a second. We've got our we've got a Cloudflow here, and if I just run this Cloudflow, hit run, and click run now. Oh, that's not good. Why? No. Ah, it doesn't want to play ball with me today. Let's hit publish all customizations and see if that fixes it. I knew the demo drops would get me eventually.
We
Yeah,
do
they're
have one
working.
comment. We
Oh,
do have
yeah.
one comment here in the chat. Sometimes during import process, it doesn't prompt me for environment variables, and it shows a banner later to update environment variables. Do you know when that happens?
It is when that's a good question. So I've seen the banner before when I've imported into when I've imported the COE starter kit into an environment, and I've not pre-configured or got the things that are required for the environment variables. Generally, if you skip it, it won't it will prompt you to that there's a non-populated environment variable. If you're not seeing it, usually it's because it either has a current value or a default value in there. It's weird that it doesn't prompt you and you're still seeing the banner. That sounds like a bug to me. As we've gone through ours, you've kind of seen the differences in them when they're in there as a current value, when they're in there as a default value, and when there's none of those values. And it's prompted me or just skipped over. Um, so yeah, that sounds like a bug with potentially the environment variables going in. Um, I do say that the environment variables should really only be imported once. You can import them multiple times if you like, but the idea is that they shouldn't really change values very often. So you should kind of import them in once as like configuration. If you need to add new ones to them, you can add new ones to them. I don't think they're really something you should be updating all the time because that can have implications into other things. So you can't use it as like a way to store data and then update data later and then change it all the time. But yeah, that sounds like a bug to me. The no prompt and the banner later on. I've only seen that when importing in the COE and then skipping the import process, the setting the value as I import. We'll give this one more try before we open it. And yeah, okay, let's just open it. I was trying to avoid opening it. Um, this is just a simple flow. It just runs, it triggers and brings to the API key in that solution version. So I was doing my best to not open it. Okay. I think it's just having an issue with the fact that potentially uh, I deleted this flow before and now I've recreated it and it's now having an issue. Because it should show flow runs down here and it's not. Okay. Um, well, to go back to my dev environment and show you what it's supposed to do. If I run this in here, run flow, done, um, it's supposed to show me the API key, which is not the one that we put in, this is the dev environment, and the version number. So the version number was the default value that we had that we didn't override. Or the current value, I can't remember which, and then the API key is something different. Now, the one again, another one of the things that has caught a lot of people out is we saw that the environment variables worked straight away with the Canvas app. They came through straight away. We could write to the right site and everything else. Flows, it's not always instantaneous. Previously, there was a limitation with flows where you'd have to turn them off and turn them back on again, or you'd have to I keep hitting the button on my microphone. Sorry. you have to turn them off and turn them back on again, or you'd need to go in there and edit them and save them and run them. But Microsoft have done away with this limitation, so I was hoping to kind of um, sort of point it out in my demo when I'm trying to run this flow, but it doesn't seem to want to it doesn't seem to want to run or know that it's there at all. It says it doesn't exist, which is strange 'cause it does exist. Um, but yeah, for flows, it is now an asynchronous process where Microsoft will push the environment variable into the flow. Yeah, it's not working. It will push the environment variable into the flow over the course of an hour. So again, it's not going to be instantaneous. And again, I'd probably recommend, especially if you have tight time frames for a deployment where you can only be down for a certain amount of time, and then you need to get back up and running, or you're deploying a live app. If you need to do this, I would deploy those environment variables first into the environment and configure them, and then later on push your flow. Now, once you push your flow after the environment variables are in, it'll pick up that new environment variable pretty quickly. If you do it at the same time, it'll take about an hour to push those things through. I believe. Again, it's all new functionality, and there's a bit of trying to see behind the curtain with all these things going on. Um, so that was the demo. Let's just flip back to my slides for a few seconds. Sorry that I couldn't show you the full flow stuff working. So I've just got a couple of slides about how to create environment variables. Again, kind of went through this before, but just trying to go through the process of adding them, choosing your type, and then when you import them, you get the ability to update the data in there. So there are some limitations. It's always good to point out limitations. So again, I kind of put the asterisks at the end of the first line. Data source only supports SharePoint currently. Yeah, it only supports SharePoint currently, but as we saw in the demo, we do see these um, the new connectors coming in. Again, SAP isn't. I don't have access to an SAP instance, so I couldn't test that. But there's nothing in the documentation about it at the moment. And Microsoft Dataverse, again, we can't really use that at the moment. I think it's coming in, and it's been deployed ahead of time, but it's not something we currently use in Flows or in Power Apps. Another limitation, secrets only support Azure Key Vault. So if you are using a secret, if you are pulling back some data from some secure data for an environment like an API key or a certificate or something like that, or a password that you don't want other people to see, at the moment the only supported configuration is through Azure Key Vault. But potentially if there are other connectors inside the Power Platform, you could use those to retrieve these, but environment variables only support Azure Key Vault at this time. Secrets also require a Dataverse unbound action. So again, if you don't come from a Dataverse background or you're not really a Dataverse person, environment variables require Dataverse for ALM. As such, there is an unexpected consequence, which means that apps that use them become premium. Although there is a um, bit of wiggle room in terms of that and what Microsoft is trying to do with it. So we may see that change in the future, but they also require what we call an unbound action. An unbound action is an action that we can call through the Dataverse connector, and that retrieves everything back. Um, there is advantages and disadvantages to using the unbound action. Again, if you have something in Key Vault, you could just use the Key Vault connector that's built straight into Power Automate and go and retrieve that secret and use it in your flow as well. So it's another option. Again, environment variables require a Dataverse database. It is a row of data in a table, which is in Dataverse. It's actually two rows of data inside the same table in Dataverse. So yeah. Also be careful importing the current and default values. We saw the differences in that import wizard. Something that had the current value, the SharePoint site, that was in there and didn't allow us to change it. The two that had the with no default data and no current value, they allowed us to go in, and the one that had the default value didn't even show up. That solution version number didn't even show up in the import. So that just went in, and you just didn't see that prompt to update it. So again, bit of a problem. I've also got a link here to all the current limitations. Now, I know what you're thinking. Matt, you've just explained all these reasons that environment variables aren't really that good. Why should I use them? What is the point of them? And I get it. You kind of just want to slope into the woods and go, well, my process wasn't that bad beforehand, so if it's a little extra work, why would I use this? That's kind of the wrong approach to take. So there are loads of advantages. No more configuration records. The amount of projects I've worked on where we've had to configure a configuration record and create a record inside a SharePoint list or inside a Dataverse table to then go and reference all the time to pull that configuration data is just crazy. So we can finally do away with this whole configuration record table, a whole table to store a single row of data that someone could potentially mess up. So we're trying to get rid of that limitation, and that's one of those great advantages. No more hard coding API keys or secrets. Again, another really bad practice, having your API keys in a flow that anyone can go access if they have the relevant permissions, or even if you don't know that they have the relevant permissions. Same thing with secrets. Um, it supports solutions in ALM. So yeah, I showed you moving a solution, the same process if you're using automated solutions. So if you're using DevOps pipelines, if you're using Pack CLI, you can use environment variables and you can set those values as you go through that process. So that's even better. Automated solutions, just hands off, just hit a button, go have a cup of coffee and come back and it's all done. Um, there's an infinite number of variables you can be stored. There is an asterisk on that. Dataverse is sort of infinite, and environment variables are just a table inside Dataverse, so they're sort of infinite as well. So you can have infinite number of them. There are some limitations though. JSON, for instance, only supports 2,000 characters. So 2,000 characters, or yeah, something like 2,000 characters. Um, Again, text will only support about 2,000 characters as well. So it's all about performance. So you need to be understanding about the data types and how you break these things down and architect these solutions. But the best thing, no more unmanaged layer when moving solutions between environments. No more needing to go into an app and change the data source after you've deployed. No more pointing your dev app to your production site and then deploying because that's the way you figure out how to do it. This is a nice and healthy ALM process with no unmanaged layers. That's what we want to get to, that unicorn with the cat riding on its back. They're also really easy to configure. I showed you like the ones that I configured. It wasn't hard. It's a WYSIWYG editor. You just choose the things that you want. You type in the things that you want. And then even when you go through the import solution, it's not all code that you need to go and try and find and update and do a control F and find all and replace all. It is just a nice and easy interface to do it. And they can be used for Power Automate and Power Apps. You can even use them in model-driven apps. If you configure things like command bar buttons using structure rows or some Ribbon Workbench and command buttons, you can absolutely use an environment variable in there, and I've done that on several occasions as well to support custom page development. So really great use for it. Uh, So my conclusion on environment variables, and you may have noticed I'm quite passionate about environment variables. I really like them. I think they're great. They're really useful for ALM if you know how to use them. If you don't know how to use them, it can be a bit annoying. It can be a bit daunting when you see current value and default value, and then you import it in, and it doesn't prompt you, and then it's all using the wrong values in production, and you're pulling your hair out. And if you're like me, you have no hair, so there's not a lot to pull out and things like that. Um, Values shouldn't really change from one import to the other. So again, the limitation that we used to see in cloud flows where you'd have to turn them on and off again or make a change, they are removing that. It's now going to be asynchronously pushed into the cloud flows after about an hour, the documentation says. Um, but you shouldn't really be updating the values all the time. These should really be static pieces of information. So like API endpoints won't change, API keys won't change, configuration data of like your apps if it's in dev or production or different values and things shouldn't really change all the time. You can change them, but it's not designed to be changed every day, every week, every month. Prepare solutions correctly. Again, that was the line that I had in here before I saw the news about um, the flows getting the environment variables pushed into them. So I would still suggest if you're not comfortable with them, create an environment variable solution, push that in first, and then your regular solution. But as I've shown tonight, you can just push them all in together, and as long as you've prepared them correctly and got the correct the removed the right values or kept the right values in, it should all go through fine. And within an hour, all my flows should be picking things up from the right thing. Um, if I didn't want to wait an hour, I could turn that flow off and back on again, and that would do the same thing as going and making that call and pulling back the new environment variable. So multiple ways to do it if you do need to be quick. And JSON allows for multiple values, and this saves on API calls. So if you're familiar with API limits inside the Power Platform, every time you do a call to something and pull some information back, it's an API call. It's the same thing for environment variables. When you go to the environment variable and retrieve it back, that's an API call to Dataverse. So every time you run a flow, it's going to do that call first. If you have multiple values, JSON can really help you with those key value pairs and allow you to configure it and create some really complex configuration things for your flows. So email addresses, API endpoints, um, keys if you don't really care about them, um, configuration data like, is this a test environment? Is this a live environment? What's the version number? Are there any notes associated with this? You can use all those in a single call to JSON. So I really like the JSON environment variable. I use it all the time. If you need to do these things, I'd highly recommend a JSON environment variable as well. So with that, thank you. I really appreciate everyone's time to sit here and let me geek out over environment variables. Um, those are all my links, so you can find me in all those social medias. Twitter, not so much these days, but it's one of those things. But yeah,
I really like the point you made about not keeping the keys in the flow. Probably see
yeah,
that more often than you want to.
yeah.
Good advantage.
Another good tip is that there's a toggle behind most of the flow steps for secure inputs and secure outputs. So even if you pull the keys into the flow via the environment variable, you can still hide them and things like that. So it's all great, but again, another thing that not a lot of people do, and you just see keys and flows all the time. It's crazy.
Sure, sure. I believe it.
Great. Well, I know it's really late, Matt. Thank you so much for
Thank
staying
you.
up, burning the midnight oil, and walking us through some really cool stuff in Power Platform.
I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys today. And if anyone has any questions about environment variables after this, you can catch on all the social medias, and I'm happy to help out and answer any questions.